And he's expressed admiration for the Chinese Communist Party.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China, because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say, we need to go green as fast as we need to start investing in solar.
They say, well, ultimately the poor will benefit. Yeah, except the dead ones.
Yes. Would you talk to him? Well, if you were to sit down and talk with him and he wanted to talk, would you? And what kind of things would you talk about, perhaps on your podcast?
I don't think I've ever said no to talking to anyone. So, which is,
Would you? Would that be a first, or would you make that conversation? Do you believe in the power of
No, I'd
conversation
ask
in
him.
those kinds of contexts?
No, if he was willing to talk to me, I'd talk, because I'd like to ask him. I have lots of things I'd like to ask him about. I mean, I've had political types in Canada on my podcast and tried to ask them questions. So I'd like to know,
Is there
and maybe I've got a big part of him wrong.
Yes.
And I probably do. But my observation has been that every chance he had to retreat from his pharaonic position, let's say, he doubled down. And our parliament is not running for the next year. It's still Zoom in. It's still COVID lockdown parliament for the next year. It's already been fatally compromised, perhaps, by the lockdowns for the last couple of years. And this is parliament we're talking about.
Yeah. There's a kind of paralysis, fear-driven paralysis that also, in part, some of the most brilliant people I know are lost in this paralysis. I don't think people assign a word to it, but it's almost like a fear of this unknown thing that lurks in the shadows, and that unfortunately that fear is leveraged by people that who aren't in academic circles, who aren't faculty or students and so on, are more in administration, and they start to use that fear, which makes me quite uncomfortable. It does lend people in the positions of power who are not good at handling that power to become slowly, day by day, a little bit more corrupt.
I was really trying to figure out, the last 2 weeks, thinking this through. It's like, how do you know? Let's say someone asked me a question in the YouTube comment. I said, well, why can I trust your advice on the environmental front? And I thought, that's a really good question. Okay, let's see if we can figure out the principles by which the advice would be trustworthy. Okay, how do you know it's not trustworthy? Well, one potential response to that would be the claims are not in accordance with the facts. But, facts are tricky things, and it depends on where you look for them. So that's a tough one to get right because, for example, Lomberg's fundamental critics argue about his facts, not just his interpretation of them. So that can't be an unerring guide. And so I thought, well, the facts exactly doesn't work, because when it's about everything, there's too many facts. So then how do you determine if someone's a trustworthy guide in the face of the apocalyptic unknown? Because that's really the question. And the answer is, they're not terrified tyrants. I think that's the answer. Now, maybe that's wrong. If someone has a better answer...
How do you know if they're a terrified tyrant?
Because they're willing to use compulsion on other people when they could use goodwill. Like the farmers in Canada objected. They said, look, we have every economic reason to use as little fertilizer as we can because it's expensive. We have satellite maps of where we put the fertilizer. We have cut our fertilizer use so substantially in the last 40 years, you can't believe it, and we grow way more food. We're already breaking ourselves in half. And if you know farmers, especially the ones who still survive, you think those people don't know what they're doing. It's like, yeah, they're pretty damn sophisticated, man. Like way more sophisticated than our prime minister. And now you tell them, no, it's a 30% reduction, and we don't care how much food you're growing. So it's not a reduction that's dependent on amount of food produced per unit of fertilizer used, which would be, at least, you could imagine it. So, okay, so you're producing this much food, and you use this much fertilizer, so you're hyper efficient. Maybe we take the 10% of farmers who are the least efficient in that metric, and we say to them, you have to get as efficient as the average farmer. And then they say, well, look, our situation's different. We're in a more northern clime. The soil's weaker. You obviously have to bargain with that, but at least at least you reward them for their productivity. Well, it's like, well, Holland isn't going to have beef. Well, where are they going to get it? Well, you don't need it. It's like, oh, I see. You get to tell me what I can eat now, do you? Really? Okay. And Holland is going to import food from where that's more efficient on the fertilizer front? There's no one more efficient than Holland. And same with Canada. And like, isn't this going to make food prices more expensive? And doesn't that mean that hungry people die?